Okay, we're live on YouTube.
Cool. Okay. Hello and welcome to another Manchester Futurist live event on YouTube. I'm Georgia and I'm your host this evening. This month, we're joined by Jonathan Ashong-Lamptey, founder and managing director of Element of Inclusion, a consultancy that helps businesses to design inclusive companies for the 21st century. He also has a podcast, which is also called Element of Inclusion. But before we hear about Jonathan's approaches to the future of diversity and inclusion, we've got a bit of admin to address. We have some rules in our code of conduct, which you can see here. Essentially, please be nice to each other and give our moderators in the comments section an easy job. You can get in touch on social media and you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook for updates on our next event. As you know, we've left Meetup and we're focusing our efforts on social media. So please give us lots of likes and follows to keep up with our activities on these platforms. You can also catch up with our videos on YouTube on this channel. And we realise at the moment that it's a really random link, but once we've got 500 subscribers, which won't be long, we can change it to our name. And that's a really good reason to hit the subscribe button now. So over to you, Jonathan.
Georgia, thank you. Thank you very much for that lovely welcome. And I think you've got another subscriber, which will be me. So thank you very much. Thank you, Manchester Futurists, for inviting me to speak. If you bear with me, I'm going to share some slides. I'm hoping everybody can see this. So I'm here essentially to share some thoughts and opinions and basically some models and ideas about the future. But before we get into that, I want to tell you a little bit about myself, whilst acknowledging that I'm not a futurist. I do think about the future a lot. So just to pick up on what Georgia said, I'm Dr. Jonathan. I work with organizations to make them inclusive. Typically, that means research, training, consulting, but I'm also, as you can see, the host of the Element of Inclusion, where every week we inform, we educate using applied research and thought leadership. So you can access the podcast wherever it is that you listen to podcasts. So hopefully, yeah, you will check that out. These are some of the organizations that we've worked with in the past sort of year or so, except I have to draw attention to the BBC. They weren't a client. We didn't do, normally whether we've spoken, we've done something with them. BBC, I appeared on BBC London News last year, around June, talking about race, diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And so we're going to be picking up on some of those points today. So with that in mind, what do I want to talk about in the short time that we have together? I would like to talk about diversity and inclusion. I want to make that make sense to you now, and also what that means for the future. I want to draw your attention to the fact that I think the future is already here. Some of the trends that, some people, or certainly I talk about, are actually happening. They've been accelerated for reasons that you'll know and understand. So we'll go into that. And then I also want to give you some ideas, things to think about how you can think about diversity and inclusion in your own life, in your own workplace moving forward. So those are the three things that I want to talk about. But before we start talking about the future, at least for me, it's actually quite useful to think about the past. So if you indulge me, PhD, here it says Doctor of Philosophy. If you've ever met me, if you listen to the podcast, I'm constantly talking about my PhD. A lot of what I do started with the PhD. My thoughts, my models, my frameworks, even just on a personal journey, my inclusion journey, you could say, all started with the PhD. But that started in 2009. So in 2009, January, I was at the Obama inauguration. I was working as a chartered accountant, and I came across this. Which is an article written in a magazine called Accountancy Magazine, and it was talking about the lack of Black accountants in the UK, specifically talking, and you can see it's got a picture of Obama. So normally Accountancy Magazine is not something I would read. I saw, oh, there's a picture of Obama, an article about Obama. I've just come back from the Obama inauguration. I'm going to read it. And so this baffled me because it was talking about the shortage of senior Black leaders, but also Black accountants in general. I'd worked at Disney, I'd worked at Channel 4, I'd worked with most media owners in the UK. It never occurred to me that this was an issue or a challenge. And so this started me on a path where I eventually ended up doing a PhD. This is the short version of the story, but I ended up doing a PhD at the London School of Economics. And this is the title. And I want to draw attention to this: Crafting an Identity, an examination of the lived experiences of minority, racial, ethnic and ethnic individuals in the workplace. You can tell I don't say that out loud much, right? It's a mouthful, like all PhD titles. But the reason I did that was because I was thinking about the future. So what do I mean? If you think about current events now, there's two things I want to draw your attention to. First is the race report, also known as the Sewell report. For everyone who's in the UK, you've probably seen or heard something about this. So this report was released, I think it was last week, and there were challenges, there were issues, there was a backlash about the content of this report. Why? The main reason, and a lot of people hadn't read the report actually in any detail, but the main reason that people were saying that they didn't agree with it, and you can see it in very small letters here, is that it ignored the lived experience. People were talking about their lived experience, which is now a mainstream term, and they're saying that it ignored their lived experience. That's why they're rejecting this article, this report. The next thing I want to draw attention to is this term, BAME, Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic. It's a phrase, it's a description. Typically it means non-white. It's what you hear people talking about all the time in organizations. Recently now, we're hearing that people don't want that term. They don't like that term. Even in this report, they said that they wanted to scrap that term. Now, what's interesting, if we go back here to the title of my PhD, I'm talking all about the lived experience. This is over 10 years ago I started this. I'm talking specifically about the lived experience, which no one was talking about then. And I don't say BAME. In fact, I chose this phrase, minority racial, and it's supposed to be minority ethnic, instead of BAME for very specific reasons. Now, I'm not a genius. Is it because I could see into the future? No, but I was thinking about the future. And that's what I want to talk about here today. The way I thought about the future and how what I'm seeing now may happen. I think it will happen because most of the trends that I spot, a lot of them happen, but actually some of them haven't. And the reason they haven't is because sometimes I'm going a bit too far. What you'll see here on my podcast, every year I make predictions, right? Predictions, I look at what happened last year and my predictions for the next year. Now, some of them are spot on, but often there's like a 1 year, 2 year lag. So I think I'm going to be probably a little bit more conservative about some of these so that I get to hit them spot on. But you'll see, if you listen to any of those episodes, you will recognize things that are happening now, and we'll be talking about that today. Now, what I don't want to do is to repeat everything that's on the podcast, although we will be touching on some key themes that I discuss. So the first thing I want to say is the future is here. You've heard this. We're here with the Manchester Futurists. You've been talking about the future. I'm sure you've been talking about the pandemic and how this has accelerated trends. Things that we expected to happen in the future have happened very quickly and are happening now. I want to avoid speaking in platitudes about all of this because you probably know and understand this in very great detail. But what has been interesting for me is to actually understand the way that people talk about diversity and inclusion. So you may have seen this phrase or heard of it before. So diversity is a reality, inclusion is a choice. You may have heard it. It's great for capturing attention. It's great for engaging hearts and minds. Another phrase you may have heard as well, and this one's from Verna Myers. I don't know who the previous one's from, but it's diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. Now, a lot of the time when people are talking about diversity and inclusion, they use these metaphors, but now we are approaching a time when organizations specifically really need to take this seriously and understand it in practical terms. So you're going to hear and see organizations being really specific, and a lot of them are hiring people to take control of this. They're going to try and be very, very practical about diversity and inclusion and the way they describe it. So the way we talk about diversity and inclusion is it's almost academic, but it's something that you can take away and use. So when we talk about diversity, we recognize it as a management approach. Okay, so we're looking in an organization. It recognizes that you, I, everybody else, we all have differences, right? We're not all the same. Diversity implies difference. We have differences, and there is value in those differences. And organizations believe because of those differences, there can be value for the organization. So that's what diversity is. Now it's useful to think about, okay, so as an individual, what does that mean specifically? Because diversity is the management approach. It's useful to think about diversity in two key ways. The first is surface level diversity. This may be things that people think they know about you, physical differences, or differences that they can observe. So maybe it'll be your age, your height, your ethnic identity. Now, the thing is that may or may not even be a surface level identity, but it's often categorized as one. Then you've got deep level diversity. These are the differences that we have that you can't observe easily. Surface level diversity, deep level diversity. So it's useful to just think about this in practical terms. When you're talking about diversity or you hear someone else talking about it, it's useful now and in the future to actually ask them, what do you mean? When you're talking about diversity, what do you mean? Are they talking about something surface level, deep level? Are they talking about the management approach? Being specific is something that I can expect you to see more and hear more of so that we can actually be more useful. The next thing is inclusion. So diversity and inclusion, often used interchangeably, they are not the same thing. So inclusion is a systematic, once again, business strategy. So we're placing all of this in the context of an organization, and it ensures that everyone shares the same advantages and benefits. What we like to say is everyone can perform, everyone can belong, everyone can reach their potential. That is the goal. We're all trying to create inclusive organizations. Some people say you need to put inclusion before diversity. We can talk about that later, but the point is, these are two aspects of organizations that people are talking about all the time. So now we've got this set up and we've got some understanding of what diversity and inclusion means in the workplace. Some of the things that are holding us back in creating this, and we talk about this all the time with our clients. This is based on the research that I've done when I meet clients, when I meet organizations, when I even look at the research itself. And we call this the three biggest problems. These are the three biggest problems, the three central issues. If you want to create inclusion in the future, you need to address this. And we call them the three Ps: people, potential, and performance. So people means that organizations struggle to engage the people that they want to include. Normally, when you hear people talking about this, the implication is they're talking about underrepresented groups, minority groups, disadvantaged groups. That's one way of thinking about it. But you also need to engage the other people, the people in the majority, the people who have privilege, the people who aren't disadvantaged. The inclusion is for everyone. We need to include everyone. So when we're engaging with people, it's not just the people who we feel need interventions, it needs to be everyone. So the engagement is not just one thing. So that's people. Then we've got potential. And this is probably the lion's share of what this is about in terms of organizations. You hear this a lot. Organizations struggle to create a culture of inclusion where everyone can reach their potential. That culture piece is essential. And it's probably one of the key focuses that we're going to see in the next 2 to 3 years, if you're not already seeing that. People talking about we need to create an inclusive culture. How they do that is something we can discuss later on as well. And then the last bit is performance. The so-called business case for diversity. Organizations struggle to articulate why diversity and inclusion is good for them. They've read the research, they've been told that it's great. Diverse organizations are more innovative, you have less groupthink, you're more creative. But if I say, okay, that's great, why is diversity and inclusion useful in your organization? Often you hear silence. Moving forward, in the future, organizations are going to put a lot more effort into understanding what that means for them. So people, potential, performance. This is a real sort of keystone concept that we apply now and in the future. If you want to create an inclusive organization, you are going to need to address these three things. So with that in mind, we've got all of this. So we understand what diversity and inclusion is. We understand some of the key issues now, but also in the future. You solve this, we argue, you've got an inclusive organization. But what's going to change in the next sort of 5 years, 3 years, maybe even in the next 2 years? So one thing is about the language. Now, saying the language is going to change, that's not really an insight. Language changes all the time, but I want to be a little bit more specific about that. So let's talk, we know that in 2020, people were talking a lot about race. People were talking a lot about ethnicity. People were talking about minority groups. So the term minority groups is a great example of some of the language that may not be appropriate, may not be useful moving forwards as we move into the future. Why? Because you may have already heard, and actually I already showed you, that BAME, Black, Asian and Minority Ethnic Groups, people are saying they want to scrap that. But when I talk about the term minority groups, I tend to be speaking in a Western context, in the UK or the US, where the so-called minority groups are in a physical minority. There are less of them. However, there's a growing narrative, and you'll hear this, where people will say, well, actually, yes, in this context, we're talking about a minority group. However, when we look at the world, the globe, we're actually part of a global majority. So you're going to hear that. If you're not already hearing people say that, instead of saying ethnic minority, you're going to hear people saying global majority. And this is really in keeping with the way the world is moving at the moment. We're moving into these global markets, global workplace, and we're going to touch on that. So this idea of being a minority isn't always appropriate. And I want to give you an example of what that looks like. So this is the ethnic group populations. These are projections for London, for Greater London. And if you look here, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, we've got here other, unclear who that is. It's everyone who they can't identify specifically. We've got Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, that term BAME, it's used here. And then we've got white. So what you can see here, when we're talking about ethnic minorities, actually the people, and BAME is often used as a euphemism for people who are non-white. We can see that the number of people who are not white is actually approaching the number of people who are white. And so the term minority starts to be a little less useful. Admittedly, this is just for London, but there are trends that show this all over the world. And so this idea of minority is a word that's going to be less useful moving forward in the future, specifically when we're talking about ethnicity and race, which have been huge topics in the past 12 months. So that's one thing. The other thing, talking about this idea of global markets and global workplace, a lot of us have been working from home if we have the privilege to do so. If you're a knowledge worker, you may have been given the opportunity to work from home. Now, that sounds great and it sounds cool moving forward, but in terms of diversity and inclusion, it actually creates opportunities for employers that I don't think many people are paying attention to. So when we're talking about work from home, sooner or later, work from home becomes work from anywhere. And once again, that sounds really great and it's already happening. The future is here. This is taken from the BBC website. Nationwide tells 13,000 staff to work anywhere. So now you don't need to be in the UK, you can be anywhere, right? Which sounds great. But now, once we talk about working from anywhere, all of a sudden, we can also hire from anywhere. So what I think a lot of people haven't really thought about is the competition for your job, particularly if you can now work from anywhere, has increased. Now, that sounds great in a global market, but it also presents opportunities for organizations to take shortcuts. When people talk about diversity, a lot of the time they're talking about representation. We want to represent the marketplace. We want to represent the talent pool. Now, if the talent pool is the whole world, and now in this case, we've got 13,000 staff who can work anywhere, sooner or later, and as I told you, I used to be an accountant, right? The accountants are going to say, well, why don't we try and cut costs? We've got all these people working in country X, and maybe they're British, maybe they're based here, or they're originally from here. Why don't we just hire people from there? That would superficially solve part of their diversity problem, wouldn't it? In terms of representation, in terms of people who are Black, Asian, and minority ethnic. We can solve that by now hiring people. And it'd be the easiest thing in the world to now say we're making some people redundant in order to hire others. This is something that I'm expecting us to see in the next 18 months. And I think there's going to be a real surprise for a lot of people. And then they get to say that they're more diverse organizations. It's a real shortcut that's going to make sense to a lot of people. Controversial, perhaps, but I think we're going to see that. So that's another thing that I'm expecting to see. Something that we are already seeing is this idea of contracts, and in particular, the social contract in the workplace. So this is a contract, a written contract. Imagine you've got a job, you've got an employee contract, which means, you know, you will work X amount of hours, you will be paid X amount for the work that you do, and this is your role, and it's all listed there. These written contracts, as you know, they can't cover everything. So we need a social contract, informal rules that say what is and isn't allowed at work. This goes back to this idea of potential and culture. The culture, the rules, the informal rules in any organization are really going to inform what that organization is about. And what we're seeing is now, obviously, because people are working from home, and, you know, as I said, we're here with the Manchester Futurists. You've probably talked about work extending technology. These are, you know, these phones, they're all over the place. They extend the role of your work. They extend what you can do. So it's a real blurred line between your personal life and your working life. And I think we're going to see that blurring even more. A common narrative around diversity and inclusion is this idea of bringing your whole self to work. People are saying that you can't be authentic unless you're bringing your whole self to work. You can't perform in the way that you should unless you bring your whole self to work. But sometimes, and I think we're going to see this, there's a performative nature in terms of bringing your whole self to work. You're expected to basically provide emotional labor. You're expected to do more than you were previously doing. So an example of that, and thinking about what's happened in the past 12 months, there have been several employees, particularly Black employees, who felt they had to perform. They were asked about their experiences. What's it like? And they had to talk about it. And so this performance, which is presented as bringing your whole self, is actually molded in a very specific way. And what I want you to draw your attention to is who gets to decide what is and isn't authentic for you. It's a huge challenge, because if you don't fit into a stereotype of what you're supposed to be, that can be an issue. So it's really important to understand who's making the rules about your whole self and bringing that to work. And so we've seen an example in the media. You can probably guess the example that I'm going to pick up, which is Luther. Idris Elba. I want to focus less on what Idris Elba said, but there's a lot of talk about the BBC diversity chief claims that Luther isn't an authentic Black lead. And it says here, the character didn't feel authentic because he didn't have Black friends or eat Caribbean food. Now, right or wrong, that I don't really want to draw attention to that. What I want to draw attention to is there is an idea of what being an authentic Black person is in this context. There may be an idea of what being an authentic gay person is, an authentic Muslim person is, an authentic person with a disability. And just to give you an idea of sometimes, I'm going to jump back. You see this? This image here, right? I use this image a lot in presentations. I've been told that this image doesn't represent diversity. I've been told it doesn't represent diversity because you can't see anyone with a disability. That's what I was told. And so I remember when someone said this to me, I was like, well, how can you tell that from this image? And what that really told me was that that person had a very clear idea about what it meant for a person to have a disability. And because they didn't see that, because they didn't recognize that, they felt that I wasn't going along in line with those standards. So this is something that I want you to really think about, because it's something that you're going to see in the future. Last couple of points I want to make. And it's about AI. It's about the tech side of things. Now, I'm not a tech expert, so I'm going to certainly stay in my lane. What I do hear a lot of, and I do get approached by many organizations who are talking about introducing technology that's designed to reduce bias. People are talking about AI, they're talking about systems that will reduce bias, make the recruitment process fair. They're going to use blind CVs, focus on competencies, not people's identity, strip everything out so that it's clear. The recruitment process, the promotion process is going to be fair. Now, that may be true. However, in the future, we also need to recognize that even if we have this technology, that affects the process, but it doesn't affect the people. It doesn't take the bias away from the people. There's an expectation that if you somehow eliminate that from the process, everything's going to be okay afterwards. And I think that's something that we should be quite concerned about and really give a little bit more attention to. Once again, this is based on the conversations that I've had. There may be people who claim that AI actually addresses that, and I think we should all be happy and actually want to investigate how and why that works. Final point I want to make is about blockchain. Once again, I am no way in claiming to be an expert on blockchain. My rudimentary grasp of it lets me believe that, you can see this now, it's a distributed network is my understanding. There's transparency, it's decentralized because it's distributed. It's very difficult to tamper with. It's very difficult to change. So what does all of that mean, and why is that related to diversity and inclusion? Well, one of the narratives that I'm hearing around blockchain is that people are going to be presenting more of themselves or information, data about themselves in a public way, whether it's a wallet. Let's call it a wallet. That's the extent of my knowledge here, right? So we can see, oh, you did go to that school, you did go to, you do have that experience. That's one thing. And can you see how that sounds very similar to the point I was making about the AI? But there's other points that are also quite useful in terms of people's identity. And we need to be really clear and careful about how this works. So if we're volunteering more and more information about ourselves, this allows people to choose us, but it also allows us to be chosen. Now, the reason why this is relevant, and I think it's really important here, is because all of this is the decentralized nature of it. Because it's decentralized, it means that existing thrones of power, existing seats of power may be unsettled. And we're already seeing this. And specifically, the example I want to focus on is what we've seen in the past 12 months. So we saw organizations, you saw it, they were falling over themselves to talk about how they were anti-racist in light of what happened with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others. And Black Lives Matter as well. There was so much reaction. Now, that reaction didn't come from the top of organizations. It came from the bottom. The stakeholders, the employees. And this bit here, I want to draw attention to, this is a headline from the Wall Street Journal, but it says, look, as more marketers take stands, pressure grows to take further action. There was peer pressure, but for consumer-facing organizations, employees and their stakeholders, the consumers, were able to impress so much pressure on the organization. And the reason this is related to blockchain is if blockchain is actually taking power away from existing power brokers, people who have the power, this could be really interesting for organized, articulate, and motivated groups, different communities, smaller organizations. I think we're going to see some real changes here, and larger organizations, they may not be able to keep up, particularly if they can't create a culture of inclusion. We may see the smaller organizations doing that. But that's my final point. If you've got any thoughts or questions, I would love to hear it. So this is me returning back to you, Georgia, I think.
Hello. Well, thank you for that. That has given us loads to think about, and I think Ahmed's going to join me now as well in asking you some questions. And those of you who are watching on the YouTube, I forgot to say at the beginning that feel free to write your comments in the chat, and anything that comes up now will read it out on your behalf and get Dr. Jonathan to answer it. So yeah, thank you for that. First off, I'd just like to say you're probably one of the only people I've met who likes talking about their PhD, because people like me who've done one just, want to cut it out of their memory from how horrible it was. But no, it seems like yours was, a really important piece for you in sort of shaping, the work that you've done since, and sort of how, the views that you've been able to use in your work. And
I should call you Dr. Georgia.
Dr. George. Well,
I think I will.
So do you know, I don't even use it normally, so it's quite like but I think just going sort of back to those points that you said at the beginning, and sort of when you mentioned this word of lived experience, and so could you just explain again for those of us who are listening what that means to you, and sort of what other people have sort of taken it as meaning?
Sure. So you hear some of my unpopular opinions, right? So we all have a lived experience, right? As individuals, we all have a lived experience. I feel that the reason that term has become very powerful in the past, in recent times, is, and if I go back to the PhD again, when I was trying to do research around diversity and inclusion, initially I was interested in the number of Black accountants in the UK. Just as a thing, how many are there? No one knew. I went to all the professional bodies, my own professional body. No one had any idea. So I wasn't actually, that kind of ends the story. What can I do and talk about? And that's on a very quantitative side, right? So I realized that even though I wanted to know and understand that there's not enough numbers, there's value in understanding the qualitative experiences. So it's stuff that can't necessarily be documented in numbers, but it can be documented in understanding people's experience. So to make it really crude, if I asked you to think about the person you loved most in the world, okay? And then I said, now tell me out of 100, how much you love that person, right? You're going to give me a number and I'll be like, oh, okay. And then, so Georgia, you'll give me a number, and then Ahmed, you'll give me another number. And based on that, if one person's number is higher than another, I might then say, oh, well, let's say Georgia's number is higher. Georgia loves this person more than Ahmed loves that person. It's not very useful, is it? Whereas if I actually asked you to tell me a story or tell me about the relationship that you have with this person that you love the most in the world, I'm going to get a lot more value that I probably wouldn't get from asking you about that number. So it's one way of thinking. The lived experience allows us to get these rich, deep understanding of how people experience their lives and particular phenomena that can't always be captured by numbers.
I guess it brings emotions into it, doesn't it? And it makes it much more human than just those numbers on a page, which
absolutely
is so important.
Yeah. And so, Georgia, if we bring that back to why everyone's talking about it now, it's because for a very long time, if you're from a group that hasn't had any particular attention in the workplace, perhaps has been ignored in the workplace, one of the things that people want to understand, because they don't know anything, is actually, what is it like being this? What is it like being that? What are your experiences, so that we can understand? And so you're right, it is very much humanizing things, humanizing people. And I can see, yeah, Ian's brought up a point, and I did see, I think it was it last week or last month, this idea on human values. I did check out what you guys do, and yeah, there was an interesting conversation. I think that was with someone from the BBC as well, but it is related to being human, which I think is another thing that's going to be really important moving forward. This idea of purpose-driven organizations, human values are at the heart of that.
Can I that a little bit more, Jonathan? You were firstly fantastic talk. Really enjoyed it, and you've sparked a couple of things I'd like to talk to you about. Sure. Probably afterwards as well. But you were saying that organizations, especially over the last summer, were kind of bending backwards to kind of show they're really inclusive and they've got a bunch of programs to. What is it that you use? What is it you look for to assess progress or decline? Kind of beyond crude numbers, or even crude numbers. It's quite hard for me to assess whether we're actually progressing, for me anyway. So I was wondering what your take on that was.
I think we're at the stage where there's not many organizations who can demonstrate much progress. A lot of organizations are still grasping. So, those basics of diversity and inclusion that we spoke about, if you go and ask organizations, what does diversity and inclusion mean to you? You won't get a consensus. You'll get inherited ideas, but stuff that's specific to them. So I look for organizations that are able to basically moving towards addressing those three biggest problems. So how are you engaging people? Yep. Are there people who you feel are under, who aren't receiving the value they should, right? Where there are imbalances. How are you attempting to do that? Tell me about your culture. What does your culture say? How does it accommodate people who don't fit the archetype? Every organization's got an archetype or a stereotype about what a top performer is. The people who don't fit that, how do they progress? And just understanding that. And then the other one is that one about the business case for diversity. It's almost like a trick question. If you say to them, okay, so I never say, what's your business case? But I say, why is diversity and inclusion, why is it good for you? Just as a casual thing, why does it work? How's it helped you? Most people can't answer that meaningfully without referring to data. We know about bias. We know, they start talking about all these things. But I'm saying, no, very difficult. So if they're able to do those things, I look at that as a very good sign.
Mm. One of the other kind of observations I've made in organizations is usually the lack of agency or real decision-making power within certain groups. I was wondering, what's your take on that?
When you say groups, who are you talking about specifically? Like,
I suppose non-white groups that I've certainly noticed, especially our high echelons of companies, barring usually the chief diversity officer or kind of. So I was wondering, what's your take on that? And it's usually quite a lot of talk around FTSE 100 companies and the lack of. So just quite.
Often you will find that the chief diversity officer also doesn't have the agency that they would like. So one of the real issues with being a chief diversity officer is that you go in with these high hopes, you're motivated, you may even been sold this idea that everyone's serious about it. You get in the organization and it turns out that people aren't as serious as they've made out. So they lack agency through no fault of their own. And that can be a huge challenge. And these are the ones that are serious. Then there's the ones who are just there to sort of, play along. But in terms of agency, I suppose that comes with experience. If we're talking in an organizational context, it comes with experience and also comes with responsibility. If you were talking about non-white groups, the data shows us, pick an organization, pick a FTSE 100 organization, we're going to find that people who are not white are underrepresented in senior positions where you would have agency, where you would be allowed to make decisions, take risks. And often to get to the positions, to get to those higher positions, you would, if you're talking about race as you were, you would choose not to take risks. You would choose not to do things that were too risky, because that would make you stand out in a way that's not positive. We have to remember a lot of middle managers, their role models. Have you heard of this concept called the frozen middle? Has anybody heard this before? So it's a concept that suggests that people at the top of an organization, they get diversity and inclusion, why it's important. People at the bottom get it. And it's the people in the middle that don't get it. Now, part of the reason that they don't get it is because they are role modeling models of success from 10 years ago, 20 years ago. These are the people who remember what it was like to smoke at work, in the office, stuff like that. So they remember that. The workplace has changed a lot. And now they're being told, no, it's different now. You need to act and behave in a completely different way. And it's quite a challenge there as well. And this is an issue. So those people, if you're trying to get along, you might try and model those people as well. Lack of agency, speaking to your point earlier. You're going to follow what everybody's doing. This is what I've seen anyway.
Go on, Georgia, back to you.
So I guess another question that I've got is around sort of your thoughts on intersectionality and the importance of that. So if you could just sort of say, you know, why it's so important to you, and sort of how your thoughts on intersectionality have developed since the PhD.
So I think so intersectionality, you know, for anyone who doesn't know, it recognizes that we have multiple aspects to our identity. So no one is one thing, right? So I'm Black. My family's from Ghana. I've got a PhD that I'm always talking about. I'm an accountant. I'm from Essex, East London. So there's all these things. And each of those things mean different things at different times in a different context. So some of these things give me privileges, right? So being 6'3" gives me privilege when I'm speaking. If we were all together speaking in a room, people say that, you know, leaders, people who are taller tend to get more attention, okay? At the same time, if I'm wearing a hoodie on a night out and it's raining and I'm walking behind your mum, yeah, you might think something different. You might not give me, oh, there's Dr. Jonathan. You might not think that, you know, you might think something different. And so intersectionality recognizes that the intersection of our identities at different times in different places gives us different results. Now, that's the way I think of it, and that's the way it's useful for us to recognize. Sometimes when people think about intersectionality, it's often from a perspective of just disadvantage. And the reason it started, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw is like a legend who basically explored this idea of intersectionality and really brought it to the forefront. I think coined the term 100%. It's often discussed in terms of disadvantage, but there's also privileges that we have as part of our intersectional identity. So the way my thoughts have developed since the PhD is to recognize that it's very context driven and it's unique there are unique opportunities, but unique challenges that we should always try to explore. It stops us being lazy.
I guess that links to what Ian's just mentioned in the chat, the 56 Black men, that campaign to sort of challenge the stereotypes that Black men face and things, and that campaign, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I was one of the 56. So in that campaign, it used what they call like a snowball sample. You'll appreciate this, Dr. Georgia, which is just you ask. So Cephas Williams, who was the founder of it, he saw that on TV, I think it was 56 Black men had been stabbed or were victims of knife crime. And whenever you saw someone on TV, it was to do with that. When I say that, a Black man. And so he thought he wanted to present an alternative view that perhaps people don't often get to see. So he thought, let me find people who are doing something different, something useful, interesting. And so he found one person and then asked them to ask, do you know anyone else? Do you know anyone else? And so there was a chain until we got 56. And there were photos of us and we were all wearing hoodies. I wear hoodies a lot. I wear hoodies at home all the time. But, and going back to your point earlier, Dr. Georgia, about PhD, one of the reasons I'm always calling myself Dr. Jonathan is because it has a very particular impact on people in a professional environment. Often you don't see someone who's Black with a PhD. It helps, frankly, it gives me advantages in the workplace. People treat me completely differently when they know that. And so one, I use it, I'm entitled to use it. It's an earned privilege, but at the same time, it's remarkable to see how leaders treated me completely differently when they know that. It is remarkable.
It reminds me of the thing in the Skepta song, which is all the complaints that were made at the Brits when I think it was Drake had all the like Skepta come on stage with him, and everyone was wearing hoodies and was dressed in black, and all the complaints about how threatening this was, because it was black men taking up a space which they're not normally in. And sort of Skepta then took that sort of voice clip and then, made it his own and took it into his own space. But it's that thing of, people taking up space that people, others don't think they should belong in, which I think is really interesting. And I guess that sort of goes on to this idea of, you say yourself, you don't fit the mold of sort of diversity and inclusion sort of thought leaders. And I wanted to know what how do you feel about that? Do you think that works, or do you think that you face barriers with that because you don't fit into this sort of traditional sense of what that should be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think I've ever been asked that before. To some extent, I play into it. I don't, because I used to be an accountant, and you have to toe a line, and I think I get to say things that other people are perhaps afraid to say. And so I use the platform that I've developed in order to say some of these inconvenient things. What's good is, and talking about this idea about the future, is that some of those inconvenient things have become more and more mainstream, but others don't. I know I don't get invited to particular events. I know there's particular organizations that wouldn't want to work with me. There's places where I don't get nominated for these awards and that awards. I know that, but I suppose I'm just trying to overperform or outperform some of the other people, because there are people in this space in terms of diversity and inclusion who are there. And I've been told this, there are people who have been promoted who work in diversity and inclusion who don't know much. They don't have that. And this is the same in any industry. But I'm there, and I have to talk about my PhD. It actually reminds me of a Chris Rock skit, right? So Chris Rock was talking about how he lives in New Jersey. He's a very successful comedian. And I think at the time his neighbor was Jay-Z, who he said was, a legendary musician, hip hop artist. And then their neighbor was a guy who was a dentist, right? So the guy who was white was a dentist, but the two black guys had to be like super amazing just to be living in the same neighborhood. And he talked about this idea about going for knockouts. You can't win on points. You got to go for knockouts, because if you win on points, then they might give it to the other guy. But if you go for a knockout, it's an undisputable win. So in terms of what I try and do, I try and let the work demonstrate that. So, I get a lot of compliments about the podcast, for example. I try and make it to a quality that it actually shows the value that I have and the value that we have to offer, as opposed to just relying on the fact that I know lots of people, maybe I'm really popular, I get invited to speak at places. That's great, but then I wouldn't be able to actually help you with your organization. I could speak in platitudes, which a lot of people do. Whereas if actually, you push me, I can actually answer these questions. I can show you the research. I can give you an example of how it worked. That's a little bit different. And so my hope is that people actually want the expertise instead of just relying on the showing and the performative aspect that we see. But I like that question. I've never been asked that before.
Well, I'm glad we've made you think. Yeah. So you mentioned the podcast then. Do you feel the goal of the podcast is working? So helping others make their workplaces more inclusive. How have you found the podcast, and, is the goal of it? Are you achieving that?
Yeah, so it's one of the things I'm most proud of in life, actually. So I say at the beginning of it, I'm on a mission to help 1 million people like you to make your workplace inclusive. So normally it's through, there's 5 types of shows. So some of it's book reviews. I review books you should be reading. I break down research. So I take obscure research. And once again, Dr. Georgia, you'll appreciate this. There's research out there that sometimes is really difficult to read or understand. I break it down to help people use it. I do explainers. So some of the stuff we've spoken about today, I talk about in a lot more detail on the podcast, just so that people can use it and talk about it and make decisions. So it allows me to scale what I know. Because one of the things, going back to the PhD, which I don't stop talking about, is there's so much knowledge there, But no one's going to read that. No one's going to read that PhD. But what if I broke it down and shared that with you, and then you can use it, make it really practical? That helps. And so for me, it's working. It's actually, yeah, it is working. People tell me it's great. We get letters, emails, letters. I know, right? We get emails every week, which are really nice emails from people. What's always funny is the amount of people who email you versus the people who like it or give you ratings is completely different. So there's people listening, but they often don't say that they listen. Who knows? Yeah.
This is a delight. This has been a delight, Jonathan. When you said, you reminded me of something when you said that some people are afraid to say things. I'm thinking about employee activism for a moment. Do you have any advice for people who have just think this is not good enough? How do I need to hold my organization more accountable? How might I go about doing that? Do you have any thoughts around kind of employee activism?
So one of the things that I talk about, or I used to talk about a lot, but it's like a hidden superpower in organization is the networks, the employee resource groups. So these are organized employees who they often share an identity, values or beliefs. These are the people that you should reach out to. Now, sometimes they're just there for show, but some of them are really motivated. That's a place that you could try and engage with. Often, what I also recommend is, if you've got an opinion, particularly around diversity and inclusion and some of the language, always seek a shared reference point. So when I talk about race and racism, I'm never trying to convince you that racism exists. All I want to do is explain the idea that, look, this is a useful way for us to talk about it. And when we're talking, you're going to tell me what you think or what you feel. So as an example, on LinkedIn, I put something on LinkedIn that was talking about race as a system of advantage. And I said, this is a useful way of talking about it. Now, some people really disagreed with it. And one person in particular, he said some things which are quite strong. And then he emailed me to say, oh, I actually appreciate what you said. I've spoken to other people. And the way he spoke, I could see how, you'd get wound up. But this is someone who I speak to all the time. Like, we speak like once a month and we talk about this. And I don't even know whether he agrees with me or not, but we're able to have a conversation. So finding a shared reference point, whether it's a book, a podcast, a TV show, anything, an article, is always a great idea. I also favor small experiments that, and I think it was Adam Grant who spoke about this, small experiments that if it goes wrong, it's not a big deal, you can walk away from, right? That is something that I recommend a lot at work.
And sorry, Georgia, I'm just being greedy now, but your thoughts around how do you hold organizations' feet to the fire and keep them accountable for some of the promises they've made? Do you have any thoughts around that?
So it depends what promises they've made. So here's a good one.
Well, maybe they haven't made even.
So let's say anti-racism, because I put that up in the presentation, right? So an organization says it's anti-racist. So first off, I want to know, do you know what anti-racism means? Because it's actually a very loaded term. And it's, if you think of the author, Ibram X. Kendi, his example and definition of anti-racism is very binary. So I would ask them, do you know what that means? If they claim yes, then I would then ask them, what are you doing? And also it's how you approach them when you're saying this. I would approach them from a collaborative perspective. The truth is, Ahmed, that not everyone is actually interested in creating inclusive organizations. The ones who do will be quite collaborative and helpful with you. Particularly the chief, we talked about chief diversity officer. They need all the help they can get. So if you're motivated to help them, and the real ones will love it. They absolutely love it. They don't have enough resources or support, so they completely appreciate people who are motivated to help hold the organization to account. So that's probably another good one. Speak to the chief diversity officer, check out the employee resource groups, the networks, try and understand the language and the narrative around all of this, but also just these small experiments conversations with people who work with you or people you want to engage. Don't argue with them. You just want to get a sense of where people are.
And we've got 2 questions from YouTube that I think one links quite nicely to just what you've been saying, which is Habs Hamilton asks, any advice of someone wanting to step into the equality, diversity and inclusion DEI space in the current climate, which I think, follows on nicely from the things you've just been suggesting there.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, so it's like the Wild West now. So it's almost everyone's a diversity and inclusion expert. So what I would do is, like anything, just develop, be useful in small ways, actually try and do things that are useful. One of the things I'm known for criticizing all the time is panel events. One of the reasons I like this and participated in this, Ian's been a supporter of mine for a while, but this is part of an ongoing program that you're doing. And you have other events and other things that you do. It's not just about having a talking shop. I tend to dislike panel events when it's all about just raising the profile of the people who are speaking and there's no practical takeaways. So I would say to anyone who's trying to get into this space is to be useful, do things that actually help and create change. You'll be surprised. There isn't that much competition for that. It's simple, but it's not easy. So I would recommend that. Small things and then go on to the bigger things. Develop expertise, get a critical mass of knowledge. Most people are reading articles on Forbes and LinkedIn, but don't actually have a depth of knowledge. If you read 20 books on diversity and inclusion, you would have so much more knowledge than most of the people who are claiming to be experts.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And the same user asks, are you seeing that the current movement of Black Lives Matter is having the opposite divide effect in some organizations with people resisting the change?
Yeah, sometimes. I think it depends on what claims the organization made and how they've actually tried to put those into account. Some organizations have said, okay, we're listening to what you're saying. That's fine. And if they've done the listening, but they're not doing anything else, they've done what they've said, and now you're going to be dissatisfied, aren't you? So they haven't actually it's about understanding what their claims are and what they're going to do. And then going back to Ahmed's point about holding them to account to see if they wanted to do that in the first place.
Yeah, no, definitely. And unfortunately, I feel like we could talk about this for hours, but we have run out of time nearly tonight for so I guess my last question is, if there was one thing which you would say for people to read if they wanted to, or sort of engage themselves with, like one resource, what would it be? If, to find out more and to sort of,
That's an easy one for me, I think, isn't it? I'm going to say the podcast. I'm going to say the podcast. And do you know what? Even if you don't listen to mine, listen to someone else's. But I would say listen to someone who actually has got a depth of knowledge, right? Even if it's on one topic and just goes deep and challenges your thinking. And sometimes it's uncomfortable as well. I would say do that. Look for, it's that depth of knowledge. There's not enough. There really isn't enough. There's plenty of room for people who have that depth of knowledge. A lot of people are still very superficial. Some organizations want that. But that's what I would say. The other thing I say is there's never just one thing.
Yeah.
So I thought you were going to say, is there one thing we can all do? There's never just one.
Yeah.
There's several things. So, but yeah, I would recommend that. Check out the podcast. If you don't like mine, check out someone else's, please.
And I guess it's that thing of, that the, people who have it's not just those who have the lived experience gaining that depth of knowledge, and, people who, like me, who is very white, learning about, different aspects of diversity and inclusion, which aren't the things which, I would normally, associate myself with. And it's, it's about learning from others and them as well. So yeah, no, thank you. I've really enjoyed tonight. It's been really interesting to sort of hear your thoughts on things. And yeah, those of you who have been listening, be sure to check out Dr. Jonathan's podcast, which is called The Elements of Inclusion. And yeah, if you've enjoyed tonight, you can join us next month for the future of micropayments with Dizigan Chinia, Amber Case and Matt Mankins. And all the details of that will be on our social media pages. So yeah, thank you again, Dr. Jonathan. Thank you to Ahmed for asking questions as well, and all of you listening at home. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you all for having me. Thank you.